Hi, everybody. Welcome to another HOSS Talks FOSS. I'm the HOSS, Matt Yakovit, head of open source strategy here at Percona, and I am joined once again by Bruce Momjian from Enterprise DB. Bruce has been on this podcast before, and we had been ships passing in the night last week at the
That's right,
Postgres conference. You know, we saw each other but didn't get to catch up, so we figured why not get on a call like this and chat and catch up on what's going on. And, so it's always exciting. You know, we've got other conferences. We're starting to be in person again. I don't know about you, but I'm glad to actually talk to people in person. Right.
There was a lot of energy in San Jose because everyone was together, and a lot of stuff you couldn't talk about online. It was just too hard to really get the emotion across. It's much easier in a group, together in person.
Yeah, and there were so many people to talk to, right? So you got to talk to a little bit of everybody. You're like, I haven't seen you in a while.
Very true.
Yeah. So Bruce, I figured maybe we would just catch up on a few topics, see what's trending, see what you're seeing in the industry. You are as plugged in can be, in terms of the Postgres community. And so I'm curious, what sort of trends, things are you starting to see evolve as you're looking towards the next year? You've been talking with folks, you've been following the mailing lists. Are you seeing a couple patterns or something that we should be aware of in the community?
Well, probably the big issue this week and last week actually was how to deal with the Russia issue. So I've spent a lot of time on that because obviously as a person in leadership, it kind of becomes my responsibility to keep an eye on that. We talked earlier about risks to the community, right? What does that look like? And it kind of spans quite a wide spectrum. For example, if we have committers in these countries, what if they can't communicate with us securely? What if they don't feel they can actually tell us if something's wrong, right?
Yeah.
And so we kind of did that due diligence to find out who has commit keys in what countries. And are all these people feeling like they can communicate with us? Because if they can't communicate with us, then effectively something bad could happen to them, something bad could happen to their keys, and we would not be aware of that, right? Mm-hmm. The second issue that's kind of hot, the same topic, is how to deal with people who want to disengage with Russia and Belarus. So we had somebody this week who did not want their blog entry syndicated to those countries. And, how do we handle that? Do we require so we have a Planet Postgres which syndicates all the blogs together, and they publicly posted that although my blog summary will appear in Planet Postgres, anyone in Russia or Belarus who clicks on the link to see the full blog will actually not see it. And how does that? It's certainly the right of that person to do whatever they want. They're creating the blog content, but to the extent that that we're syndicating that, is that acceptable? What does it do to the user experience if everyone was to do this? What if Russians were to post a blog that was only visible to people in Russia? Would we accept that? Right? Like you see how it could kind of spiral out of control.
Yeah, and I know this is a topic that is a hot topic. In fact, Amanda Brock from Open UK is going to be talking at our conference specifically about some of these topics from an overall open source community perspective, which should be interesting. It's a slippery slope, but it's not the first time we've had a bit of controversy around this. If you remember, GitHub blocked some countries when they had embargoes against them, right? So if you were in certain countries, you couldn't get to your GitHub project. And that was a big hubbub a couple years ago because it was like, oh, wait a minute, what happened with this? Postgres being in a bit of a different space, but it does follow that same kind of geopolitical pressure, if you will, because countries come and go on, these different, embargoes. So you have not only governmental regulations on what's allowed, but then you have moral and ethical questions that come up. And it's a very difficult topic because, you do see some open source projects start to develop morality clauses and focus on, do we need more ethical, like compliance things? But that's a dangerous slope as well.
Yeah,
because,
it is.
If you think about, from a license perspective, you can use this software unless your name is Bruce,
Right.
or, that how do you enforce it? How do you ensure that happens? So it does become a little dangerous. And you might have seen there was several articles, over the last, month or so since the war in Ukraine started, where some people actually put in poison pills in their open source.
Yeah, that was really serious, and obviously it affects the reputation of that project. It also some ways spills out to open source in general, right?
It does. Because it seeds doubt, right? In a company.
Yeah, and this is not. I did write a blog entry on the website called "The Abuse of Open Source" with a question mark, because this is not a completely new thing. When you think of, you go back to Alfred Nobel and the dynamite and him creating the Nobel Prize to sort of offset the damage. Think of the Manhattan Project engineers trying to prevent the use of the atomic bomb against Japan. But also, even more recently, there was some open source concern about the use of open source by the U.S. Immigration and Custom Enforcement, ICE. And that was sort of, it came and went. Really didn't really stick very much. But yeah, it's sort of like, how do you put the genie back in the bottle? If it's knowledge, and software in some sense is knowledge, right? Can you restrict that knowledge? And if you do, what are the ramifications of that? And that's really where we've kind of come through. I mean, obviously the open source the term of what would be considered open source by the OSI does not have any discriminatory use to it. But then how do you deal with a blog entry that you're syndicating that has discriminatory use? So we're just kind of keeping an eye on it. It's not something we're ready to take an action on. Obviously, if it became widespread, and in fact, the blog entry explained in detail how other people could do the same thing if they want to, showed Nginx examples of how to do it and do geolocation stuff. So the person in some ways is advocating that others follow this pattern. I haven't seen anybody follow it. If it becomes followed and it really hampers the usability of Planet Postgres itself, that could be a concern, and maybe we have to add, because the bottom line, and you aware of this as well, is that open source, by definition of the OSI, has no discriminatory real use to it. So how does that OSI license for the software, how much does that spill into the infrastructure that we support and the Planet Postgres infrastructure that we support? And how does that deal with content creators who may have discriminatory, right? And so that's if you want to know the hot topic for the past 2 weeks, that's it. He just did it basically 2 days ago or a day and a half ago. So it is the hot thing. I've been working with the Russians for, since the invasion, making sure they're okay, trying to, obviously Postgres has relied a lot on Russian technology, Russian software, engineers, and all that. A lot of that non-relational stuff came from the Russians. So that I'm going to be speaking at Percona Live. So, how do you honor and show appreciation to the work that's been done in the past by a very very dedicated Russian team, at the same time not supporting an invasion? And how do you also help them who probably are as upset or more upset than we are? I put a personal blog out yesterday, basically saying, the title is "The Russia I Grew Up In Doesn't Exist Anymore." And this is a gentleman who left Russia for Georgia. And he basically said, I'm talking about the hope for this country to be happy and free. It's gone. It's not there anymore. And it probably will not happen now in the next 20 or 30 years. And, we're sitting here trying to understand what the new normal is. But the Russians who really understand the tragedy of this are also trying to figure out what the new normal is in a way that impacts them even more than us. And the gentleman also, talked about how tragic it is in Ukraine, and certainly more tragic than it is for the Russians. But it's trying to sort of explain that what that looks like going forward for Russia is really very unclear and very dark.
Yeah, no, and I mean, from a Ukrainian perspective, we all have colleagues. Lots of Percona employees are from the Ukraine and Russia.
Yep.
Our founder, one Ukrainian, one Russian.
Yep.
And I think that from a overall perspective, no one that I have talked to that I have connections with in the community space, thinks that anything that's going on is right or just or morally justified. It is a horrible situation, and it's amazing the dedication of those folks in Ukraine, and not only do they love their country, but a lot of them are still working, and it's and under the stress, and it's you have a lot of admiration for people who are willing to stand up for what they think is right.
Yep.
Now, without minimizing that very difficult situation, and that is a tragic area. Let's shift over a little bit to some of the more technical topics, some of the Postgres side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I had given a talk last week, and it was interesting. My talk was on how developers are going to impact the future of Postgres and the development cycles. And I wanted your take on this because this is a trend that I am seeing more and more. I'm going to say something that many people disagree with me, but I have a reason, so I might have to explain. A lot of developers, end users, don't like databases, right? They don't think databases are cool. They'd rather spend their time doing other things. A lot of times they think they're too complex. And the needs for people to move fast and not have to think are increasing. And that's not necessarily a good thing. I am not I don't condone that, but I am seeing more and more people looking at no code or low code solutions. For years we've had to deal with ORMs connecting to databases.
Yeah, exactly.
For years we've had frameworks and things, but we're starting to see an escalation in terms of the needs and the desires, and almost a de-evolution of the skill set that most database professionals have. And so that worries me a bit in terms of inflection points from a open source database perspective, because it means less feedback, but it also means people doing things that the databases were never intended to do, which could result in new features, or it could result in entirely new projects or crazy things that try and take what we've already done and evolve it into something completely different. And I don't know if that's a trend you've been tracking or seeing, but I'm curious on your take on that.
Yeah, it's funny. I thought of something that I had never really thought of before, because you were talking about, right, how is what's the new normal here? What are people kind of wanting from a database, right? And I kind of go back to my time as a developer back in the 90s, where we used to write applications. And a lot of times I'm afraid that developers approach the data store of their application as though they're the only person running it. So they're basically, in their head, as they're thinking of their application, they're thinking, okay, I got a flat file here, or I've got, an ISAM thing here, whatever. And when I'm writing my application, I'm like, okay, I read a record, I put a record back, I read a record, the standard ORM kind of approach. But they're not, they don't really want to embrace the fact that thousands of people potentially are doing it to the same data store at the same time, that there may be billions of records in there that are getting analyzed, that are getting joined, that are getting processed in other ways. And they're frustrated. They're frustrated that, why is this so complicated? Why can't I just get my data? If this was a single user application, I wouldn't need any of this, right? And they may be right. A lot of cases, you don't need a relational system if you've got a small amount of data, and it's not, they're a single user, so, and of course, SQLite's a fantastic solution for that, although that itself is SQL, so maybe that's negative. I don't know. But it feels like there's so much focus on tool sets and tool chains and the new development paradigm of the month. It seems that they just don't have time. They don't have focus. They're very focused upward out in what the UI looks like and sort of how that's going to display to people and what's the user experience going to be, and that's great. But they don't want to look at that bottom piece. I think one of the things that makes me unusual is I've always been a tinker. I always go downward. I'm always like, when I started with computers, I read CPU books to understand how does the hardware work, how does the I/O work. I remember looking at UARTs and how does ISA bus, right? And because of that, as an application developer, I started to look at how does the database doing what it's doing, right? Because I'm wanting to understand downward. If I'm understanding the hardware, I need to understand how the data. And I got involved with Postgres because of that interest at the lower level, right? But the question is, how do you do that for people who aren't inclined in that way? And that's tough. I mean, I think a lot of the stuff, a lot of the non-relational stuff that Postgres has really is very fascinating. And I think one of the reasons it's resonated with so many developers is because it gave them a reason to like relational systems. Because all of a sudden, you could, it wasn't this very restrictive thing, and you could do these cool things that would be really hard to do in your application. And I almost think as a relational database, we have to continually market that. And I think the best way to explain it for me is that having understand the server, understanding how MVCC works and how locking works and how aggregates work and all of that query optimizer stuff works, right? How all of that kind of fits together to make the developer's experience super simple, right? Because that's the beauty for me of it. Because if you don't use a relational database, you need something complicated done, you have to do it in your application. So I'm always, regularly telling people that the database is the thing that makes your application simple. And as soon as you leave the relational system, whether you're going for a NoSQL solution or something else, your application, as you're saying, is going to be a lot harder. And you're going to do stuff that you really shouldn't be doing, like a nested loop in your app when you should be doing a hash join or a merge join. You may not even know what those things are. And you certainly don't want to be writing them. And you certainly don't want to be writing them in a way that you auto-detect what type of result set should use which type of join in your app.
Now that reminded me of a story.
Yeah.
So I was actually helping a company, and the company doesn't exist anymore. Really bad model. Their model was to create a social media like app or website for your music playlists. So it was a little unusual, but I remember going there, and these were really smart MIT, Stanford folks, and they actually just selected all of the data out of table A, all the data out of table B, and then they joined it in Java. And then they did their joins in Java. They filtered out the data that they wanted, and then they threw it back. And then they went and they got another set of data, and they did the same thing. And they couldn't understand why the performance was so atrociously bad. And it's like, why do you think you're smarter than the people who wrote the joins within the database? Why are you taking everything and reinventing the wheel? But they thought, because they were super smart, that they could outthink, the database and do it in a better, more efficient way. I mean,
yeah.
At least I have to give them some credit for actually thinking about how joins work, because I think in a lot of cases people don't even think that. But it is a strange thing, because you're right. A lot of people, they'll not understand the database, how it works, and that causes issues. And I think that there is a difference, though, between those who don't care and those who just don't have the time, right? And so I think it's a nuance. But I think some people do care, and they kind of like, they'll just trust that the database handles it and just figure it out later. And those people, they can develop bad code, bad designs. They can cause all kinds of issues. But then there's the ones that just don't care, and I think those are a bit more dangerous. But I think that where I'm a bit concerned, and this is one of those interesting things, the rise of people taking parts of Postgres and building other databases and trying to establish new kind of like norms. I wonder what your take is on that. And what let me give you an example, right? You've got some folks will take the Postgres client libraries, Cockroach, Yugabyte, other folks. I mean, great databases, great technology, have no problems with them as companies, but it's a trend to kind of replace the back end of Postgres. And then I've seen other ones that are taking and sticking with the back end of Postgres and adding compatibility layers on top to change all of the client protocols to make it something that it isn't. So it's weird, because it's Postgres-like, but it isn't Postgres, right? And right. So, I'm like, ooh, how does this fit into the new ecosystem? And is this one of those, you're going to be talking about challenges and risks. Is this a risk where, you start to see a bit more of a fracture, or is it something that we say, this is just yet another kind of distribution? I just had someone on a podcast who, likened Postgres to Linux, right? And so this is just another distribution of Linux. Mm-hmm. And so it's an interesting take, and it's a bit of a slippery slope. And, it's something that I've seen more and more of. And so, and I'm not saying any of these technologies are bad. I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong. I'm just curious where this takes the ecosystem in the next 20 years.
Right. Yeah. I do have a slide actually about that in the deck for competitive challenges. So the good news is this is not completely, this is not entirely new. I mean, we had, I think that, I mean, we've had sort of forks of Postgres way back to when I started. So I think Netezza might have been the first one who basically tailored it for FPGAs. So they had an FPGA storage kind of solution in the early 2000s, late 90s, I think. It's pretty far back. Then we had some ports that ported Postgres to Windows before we had a port. One was out of Japan, one was out of Boston. Then we started to get a lot of data warehouse forks. Certainly Greenplum being the best one. And then and now we're getting more of the distributed forks. So I almost feel like whatever sort of hot topic there is, some startup kind of comes along and says, hey, let's do a fork of Postgres and do X, right? We've always had, as a community, mixed feelings on these things. I've always been of the opinion that the forking has two possibilities, right? The first possibility is that the new fork becomes so popular that it basically eclipses the original project. Now, you might think that's kind of bizarre, but if you look at, I believe it's was it EGCS, the GCC compiler that effectively was a fork of GCC, and it became so popular that the GCC people had to eventually take it and make it the new GCC. Okay, and the reason for that was because the GCC project had become so conservative in adding compiler optimizations that EGCS came along and it did stuff everyone wanted, and everyone was like, well, this is all we want, and if GCC isn't going to do it, we're going to use that. So GCC had to move over and just say, we have to be, that's what we're going to use from now on. And all the current code for GCC is now really EGCS in a way, right? The second possibility is that the project, the fork becomes this extra thing that sort of takes a workload that the original thing doesn't do and tailors it for that. Whether it's, for Greenplum, it would be data warehouse. For Yugabyte, it would be distributed, and it doesn't do what the original does as well, but it does the distributed thing well, right? And I frankly am fine with that. I really feel that effectively, as that new workload becomes popular, either we bring some of that code or those ideas into Postgres, or that project continues to grow, but they also need the community to grow at the same time, and they basically help to fund and bring Postgres forward. So, if we look at Greenplum, there's been certainly a lot of engineers from Greenplum who have helped us. There's a Percona Postgres, right? I think there's EDB Postgres. There's a Fujitsu Postgres, and as far as I know, all of those projects are helping. RDS, certainly Postgres is bringing in a lot of engineering help. So I kind of see it as better. It's really a question of whether you see the world as expansive or limited, right? If you think of the world as having limited resources, limited opportunities, and you have to basically close off the challenges to your world, then you're going to see these forks as negative. If you think of an expansive universe where they're opening up the use case for Postgres, they're opening up the visibility of the project, and you have to have the confidence that the project's strong enough to remain viable and visible in that environment, then you're gonna embrace that. Even if, for example, Greenplum for the first 10 years or whatever really just forked Postgres and didn't really come back a lot. There wasn't a whole lot of feedback. And then a couple of years ago, they're like, oh, we really need to get up in current Postgres. There's a huge lag now. We're missing a lot of features. Let's get some engineers involved. Let's bring the code up to current Postgres. I don't know where they are on that now, but the point is that fork, and certainly the EDB fork with the company I work for, has helped fund the community. And if we prevented those, then we wouldn't have those, we wouldn't have those resources.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's the philosophy of you make the pie bigger, everyone is more successful, right? So more contributions, more people who are contributing to the ecosystem, more eyeballs, more usage,
right.
We don't need to fight over the same territory right now.
But you have to be a healthy project. You have to be nimble. You have to be one that embraces new people coming in. It doesn't happen by accident. And if you're rigid like the GCC was, then this is going to be a problem. You really have to be, you have to be pretty strong. And in fact, I have another slide talking about whether cloud could eclipse open source. That's another similar concern where the cloud becomes a fork, the cloud deployments, the cloud database services become a fork. Could they become so big that people don't even know the project exists, right?
Oh, yeah.
And what would that look like? So it's a similar kind of case that where you have this service that's out there that's kind of fortunately they're using your name, right? So you're kind of okay there. But could it become so big that nobody even downloads your software anymore? Nobody knows who you are. People don't think there's a way of getting involved except through the cloud provider, right?
Yeah, and that is a risk, right? That is a risk. Yeah. So, Bruce, I like to I started this since our last podcast. I like to end with kind of a rapid fire set of questions, just some random things.
Sure.
Just interested in your people can get to know you a little bit, and also give you the opportunity to share some insight. So, what is your favorite upcoming feature in Postgres 15?
Probably, if I take a guess right now, the movement of the this is really geeky, the movement of the stats collector to shared memory. That was a big thing for us. So, it's something that's been a long-term issue that I think is gonna improve quite a bit.
What was your favorite release of Postgres? Like, do you have a favorite? Like, this one was just
probably the one that added the Windows port was the coolest. Yeah.
Okay.
That would be 8.4, 8.3, something like that. Yeah. 8.0.
Okay.
Maybe it was 8.0. I can't remember.
Okay. Fair enough. Last book that you read?
The last book that I read was a book on Amish history.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm on my 4th Amish book. I'm looking over it there at the bookcase.
Oh,
something I've always
excellent.
been interested in, because the pandemic, I'm home a lot more. So, all right, let's get to the books.
All right. So that's an interesting one. And so also curious, if we are to meet you at a conference and we're to go to dinner, what's your favorite food?
Well, I just came back with a conference. I had 2.5 ribeyes in 5 days, so I guess it's ribeye.
Oh yeah, so steak eater there. That's okay.
It's not necessarily my favorite, but it's the one I don't get at home a lot. So I have a tendency to favor that. So I have a tendency to favor stuff I don't get at home, like jambalaya. I love. Steak. I pretty much love everything. So yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, and we're gonna end with this one. If you can get through to developers worldwide or technologists worldwide with just one thing that you wish that they would do, what would that one thing be? Making you think here. Making you sweat. No right or wrong answer.
It is tragic to find that there's an easy solution to something that you spend a lot of time working on. And a lot of times that answer is in the database.
Okay. Make use of the tools that are available to you, understand the technology that you're using, and explore your databases more. Always good advice. Bruce, thank you for hanging out with me today on the HOSS Talks FOSS. I appreciate you stopping by. We're going to look forward to catching up in person at Percona Live in a few weeks here. That should be exciting. And any final words for the audience here?
No, I'm certainly looking forward to Percona Live. So I think this might be the first time I've done the US one. I've done the European ones quite a bit.
Okay. So which is unusual because you're from the US. So
yeah, well, what happens is the events are always on a travel. I'm already out there, so it's like I'm already in Europe. Yeah. So every time it's been in the US, it's been a conflict, but it's always worked out. It's in Europe, so I'm so excited. I'm excited to go to Austin and be in person again together, right?
Yes, indeed.
To hang out and have a good time. Yeah, it is really something I've missed.
Yeah. And for those who are watching, go ahead and like this video, subscribe to it, give us comments, give us questions, tell us what audience or guests you would like us to pursue in the future. If you'd like to hear from Bruce again, you want me to bring him on and grill him on some topic, feel free to suggest that as well. I'm happy to do that. You know me, I like to talk to people. But Bruce, hopefully that's okay with you. I didn't ask him before I said, go ahead and have me grill him. But until next time, we appreciate you hanging out with us. We'll see you later.
Bye-bye. Great.
Wow, what a great episode that was. We really appreciate you coming and checking it out. We hope that you love open source as much as we do. If you like this video, go ahead and subscribe to us on the YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And of course, tune in to next week's episode. We really appreciate you coming and talking open source with us.